Welcome everyone to the colloquium this afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome Tarun Saint to give the colloquium talk this afternoon. His talk is titled Why We Should Read Science Fiction from India/South Asia. Tarun did his doctoral research in the English department and he at Delhi School at DU. He worked on partition literature and he taught English at Hindu College until recently when he chose to quit and become a freelance writer. That I suppose is the dream of most people in the audience and researcher. Tarun's published a book called Witnessing Partition, Memory, History, Fiction. He's edited a book titled Bruised Memories, Communal Violence and the Writer, and co-edited with Ravikant, Translating Partition. He's also co-edited Looking Back, India's Partition 70 Years On, with Rakshananda Jalil and Debjani Sengupta. More pertinent, perhaps, to the talk this afternoon, he is edited the Golan's book of South Asian science fiction, which I would urge you to get your hands on if you haven't already seen it. It's lovely. It was an absolutely refreshing read for me. And his introductory essay is really very helpful in setting the context for sci-fi writing in the country. He's about to publish the second volume in the same series this year. Tarun, that was my quick introduction to you. Now it's all yours. But before you start, Tarun, the audience, after Tarun's talk, there'll be time for questions and answers. Please key in your questions in the comments section and we'll pass them on to Tarun for his responses. Thank you. Tarun.
Thank you so much. Indeed a pleasure to be here, and I wish I could be in Bangalore in person. It's one of my favorite cities. I remember visiting for the Bangalore Literary Festival last year and hearing Chandan speak very eloquently there. And such are the times we're living in. Thanks very much to the APU, to the organizers, Chandan, especially for this chance to share some of my ideas. So let me plunge right in. My objective in this talk is to show the significance of Indian/South Asian science fiction as a subgenre. To begin with, let me take a step back. I will try and first consider the definition of science fiction stemming from the historical context in which the genre arose. Chandan will recognize that I'm drawing on the introduction to the volume he just mentioned. So modern SF comes to the fore with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the novel Frankenstein in 1818, in the wake of the Enlightenment and Romanticism. This remarkable novel fuses Gothic elements with the epistolary novel and the novel of ideas. It's about a scientist's hubris, which brings him low as he seeks to reanimate a creature made of parts taken from corpses. The novel effectively portrays the horrors of scientific innovation and technology unhinged from the realm of the ethical. However, the term science fiction was not used then. So Mary Shelley was unaware, perhaps, that she was founding a genre. The term itself was coined first in the next century, in the 20th century, by Hugo Gernsback in 1926. He actually used the term scientifiction to begin with, which was a bit of a, again, portmanteau term. And since this was rather clumsy, it was discarded for plain old science fiction. He was the editor of a pulp magazine, Amazing Stories, in the US. And such pulp magazines became the vehicle for a large number of adventure stories in the SF vein, carrying forward the tradition of scientific romances as the works of H.G. Wells in the 19th century and early 20th century again, and Jules Verne were earlier described. Then we have, of course, the next phase in the development of the genre, the golden age of the 40s and 50s, inaugurated by the arrival of the editor John W. Campbell in 1937 as editor at Astounding Science Fiction, another such magazine. And this ushered in a turn towards hard science and more plausible storylines. Of course, we are aware there are some important authors like Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert Heinlein, who came to the fore along with many more at this particular juncture. I'm here sort of compressing a lot of history into a kind of brief account to flag just some of the key aspects of the genre which have a bearing on my later account of Indian science fiction, as you'll see. So in the next phase, then we have New Worlds, another magazine published in Britain, edited by Michael Moorcock. In the 1960s, this particular magazine emphasized experimental writing, interiority, psychological questions, and a more complex use of language and plot. So J.G. Ballard, Harlan Ellison, later in the United States again, Samuel Delany and Philip K. Dick were all published in this particular context of the new wave emerging on the scene, a new wave which was marked by perhaps what we could describe as a turn to social science fiction or soft SF, with anthropology, sociology, and other human sciences shaping the work of, for example, writers like Ursula Le Guin and James Tiptree Jr., the pen name of Alice Sheldon. So the focus was more on perception, mood, emotion, inner space rather than outer space, if you like. Of course, there are many strands in the development again since then of the genre: cyberpunk, Afrofuturism, which of course, as Inedi Okorafor, one of the major writers of the genre, has pointed out, which has a completely different foundation. But I won't go into that history here, except insofar to suggest that perhaps, yes, these progenitors had a bearing on the shaping of Indian science fiction and South Asian science fiction as well. So if we track Indian SF's development, the origin could be perhaps traced back to the key year of 1835, when a young student at Presidency College, Calcutta, K.C. Dutt, Kailash Chandra Dutt, wrote his story, A Journal of 48 Hours of the Year 1945. Now, once again, he had no clue that he was writing science fiction. Rather, it was a kind of form of futuristic writing, an account of an anti-colonial rebellion, a failed rebellion, which happens 110 years later, into 110 years in the future, in 1945, uncannily enough. So this I consider a landmark story, along with his cousin Shashi Chandra Dutt's story, The Republic of Orissa, which similarly projected a rebellion into the future. So you could say that these were examples of proto-SF, not quite there yet, proto-SF. Unfortunately, such futuristic writing did not become a full-fledged tradition. So in effect, this could be considered what John Pierce calls a dead end. But in the late 19th century, there are stories written in Bangla, in fact, in the Bengali language, with identifiable SF elements once again. Two one could refer to are Jagadananda Roy's Shukra Brahman, published in 1895, translated by Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay's Travels to Venus. In this story, a journey to another planet, to Venus, turns out at the end of the story to be a dream after all. So whether it qualifies strictly as SF or not may be questionable. Then we have Jagdish Chandra Bose's Nirudeshar Kahani, Story of the Missing One, published in 1896 and revised in 1921 as Polatuk Tufan, Runaway Cyclone. Bose combines, of course, mystery and SF in this story about a scientist who uses a bottle of hair oil to calm a cyclone at sea, anticipating in the process perhaps the butterfly effect. He was, of course, a great universalist, besides, of course, being a science fiction writer, well, really known just for this major, in a major way, this one story. And in 1905, soon after, Rokhaya Sakhawat Hussain wrote a feminist utopia, that is Sultana's Dream, which depicted a patriarchal society completely undone. In fact, all the relations of power are inverted in effect. And this utopia, perhaps written as satire, also perhaps didn't become a full-fledged tradition of utopian writing in Bangla, as I'm told by fellow scholars who work in the field. But yes, the whimsical aspect, the element of humor is strengthened further with the writing of Shukumar Ray, who brought in this dimension in the diary of Heshoram Hoshiar, while Premendra Mitra and Satyajit Ray often use the tall tales template in their SF narratives. And of course, we're all familiar with the Professor Shanku series initiated by Ray. Arun Avasina has just translated the 4 Little Green Men stories and radio play written by Adrish Bardhan, one of the major writers of SF in Bangla, Premendra Mitra, Dilip Roy Chaudhary, and Satyajit Ray, which were broadcast as an interconnected set of tales on radio in 1966. So these little green men were purportedly aliens who had assumed human guise and who were living amongst us, little to our knowledge. And there's a sense of the sinister, the macabre, and perhaps even a dimension of the absurd in these interconnected tales. And this radio play had been lost for many years, but it has been retrieved after Bardhan's passing by Dip Ghosh and the Kalpabiswa team in Calcutta. So hats off to them for their literary detective work. So this sinister infiltration ultimately sort of is perhaps captured more in terms of mood, and there's a sense in which the other is presented as a vantage point from which to once again map the self, as is often seen in SF. Bangla SF is perhaps still the most strong regional tradition of SF writing, and I'm in touch with some of the writers there for the purposes of the forthcoming anthology. Writers like Soham Gua, done excellent work, and Trishna Basak is another important writer writing from a woman's perspective. Now, in the time available, I wouldn't be able to map the entire history here, and it would also require perhaps skills, language and cultural skills, which I don't possess. We need more teamwork, I think, to track this history in further detail. And some scholars are already on the job, so let me not duplicate those efforts. I'll just flag once again a few important figures. So in Marathi, another major cosmopolitan language in which SF really took off, Jain Narlikar has led the way. In Assamia, in Assam, Dinesh Chandra Goswami is perhaps best known. In Tamil, Sujata has been extremely popular. Bal Fondke, an editor from Maharashtra who wrote in Marathi, he put together a collection titled It Happened Tomorrow in 1993. In that, he argues that Indian SF too moves from adventure stories in its initial phase to hard science-based SF narratives influenced by the Golden Age narratives, hence my prior summary of the SF history, followed by a phase of stories more critical of science and technology in the wake especially of the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the damage done by the atomic bomb there in Japan. And also, of course, in the aftermath of the effects of modern industrial development on Indian society. And finally, he tracks a movement towards a more aesthetic expression, perhaps in SF writing in recent times. We need more concerted efforts by scholars, young scholars. So let's hope some of the students listening in here might take this up as a challenge. There are, of course, important critics and historians like Suparno Banerjee, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Sami Ahmad Khan in India, and Nusrat Kamal has done very important work in Pakistan, who have traced the indebtedness of this subgenre to specific cultural forms which predated them in our context, including the domain of the fantastic, whether it is the kissas and dastans of Urdu, the Jataka tales, perhaps even prior to that, the epic and mythological context. But there are also newer idioms which have appeared in the wake of the challenges ushered in by the policies of the developmental state in a globalized world as we see, especially in the post-1991 era. So with that, I focus on now the more contemporary variants of SF. In the moment we are living in, with the pandemic redefining norms of life and existence, it may well be that science fiction has become the new realism of the era, as Adam Roberts prophesies may well happen in the wake of an imagined cataclysm in his novel about an unremitting snowstorm with an Indian protagonist, as it so happens, titled Snow. In the process, so SF is indeed beginning to seem like a new realism, given the extraordinary changes being witnessed in recent times. So, as we've seen, leading up to the 1990s, we have a whole set of SF writings, which in some cases tended to be a bit didactic, with a pedagogic intent, extolling the glories of science. But there was also the spirit of protest underpinning the counterculture, which had an influence after the 60s, a questioning of the tenets of and the dominant paradigms of development, predicated on an uncritical acceptance of derived notions of the benefits of Western science and technology, and local movements, grassroots movements based on an ecologically sensitized understanding of the significance of indigenous and local knowledge also had an impact on SF writing. The process of liberalization of the Indian economy from 1991 onwards necessitated even more sharply critical responses in society, mirrored in both literary and popular fiction. It's thus no confidence that what Suparna Banerjee calls a new wave of Indian SF writing came onto the scene from the 90s onwards. Such futuristic visions were often underpinned by revulsion at the trends inaugurated by globalization at its worst, with consumerism and a newly emboldened form of majoritarian nationalism feeding off the anxieties generated by changes taking place in society and culture. The critical vision of the direction taken by the collective drew impetus from energies released by the environmental movement and critiques of mainstream development. At the same time, ironically enough, liberalization and economic reforms meant that many more international publishers opened branches in India, with new avenues emerging in the sphere of both literary and genre fiction. Two major SF interventions during this time are Amitav Ghosh's SF novel, The Calcutta Chromosome, and Manjula Padmanabhan's SF play, Harvest. Both brought in a skeptical view of science and technology, underpinned by a humanist perspective from different vantage points, with Ghosh in particular looking at the history of colonial science from a distinctively post-colonial angle. So such ecologically sensitive and at times gender-inflected narratives with a distinctively individualistic flair took flight in the first decade of the 21st century, with Padmanabhan's Escape, 2008, and The Island of Lost Girls, following that, setting the tone. The first two novels of a projected trilogy, these dystopian novels took on the problem of a drastically skewed gender ratio in a society in which girls are rarely born due to long-standing trends preferring male children. Eventually, the protagonist flees the country in which she was born with its restrictive policies and systematic gender discrimination and reaches an island run by women, which, despite being a haven of sorts, has its own complex politics at work. Pioneers like Anil Menon and Vanna Singh at this time pushed the boundaries of Indian SF with many publications in international magazines before their own volumes of stories or novels appeared, at times with a diasporic inflection to their own expressions. Anil Menon has spent years in the US as a software professional before returning to Pune in India, while Vandana Singh has taught physics there for many years after early education in Delhi. Vandana Singh's SF stories were collected in The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet and Ambiguity, Machines and Other Stories. She also wrote a speculative fiction manifesto included in her first collection, which outlined the revolutionary potential of the genre with the crucial what-if question, allowing a questioning of hierarchies and receive knowledge about the world. In her much anthologized story, Indra's Web, from her second collection, Singh conceptualized a Suryanet, a solar energy network in Ashapur, a slum near Delhi, that draws on the language of communication of plants. The story draws on both traditional knowledge and contemporary biology and physics in its depiction of the relationship between the protagonist, a young scientist, and her grandmother, as they seek a solution for the energy crisis. Anil Menon has since written two SF novels, The Beast with 9 Billion Feet and Half of What I Say. His first novel was published by Zuban, and this is about a geneticist forced to go on the run and the effects this has on his family, especially his daughter Tara. Half of what I say extrapolates from the anti-government protests of 2011 to imagine a substantial challenge to state power mounted in the future by a force called Lok Shakti, or people's power, in a speculative novel that interrogates the limits of formal technique in myriad ways. The field continued to expand apace in the first decades of the new century, with SF writing being published to critical and popular acclaim. It became a vehicle, SF became a vehicle for raising important ethical and socio-political concerns. Rimi Chatterjee's Signal Red 2005 brought in a compelling reflection on the infiltration of scientific institutions by right-wing fundamentalists in the near future, an exercise in the sociology of science as much as an SF thriller. Priya Sarukai Chabria in Generation 14, which was revised as Clone in 2019, experimented with different timelines, braided together history and the future to come in the process of telling her story about artificial intelligences who are seeking to take measure of what it is to be human. Shovan Chaudhary's dystopian satires, The Competent Authority and Murder with Bengali Characteristics, combine trenchant critiques of state absolutism and the deadening effects of bureaucratized life in India with absurdist humor. Samit Basu has continued to attract many readers with his blend of science fiction and fantasy, culminating in his well-received Chosen Spirits, which followed the lives of social influencers in an authoritarian future, recognizable to many in the media-saturated India of today. Indra Pramit, Greta Thunberg, anybody? So, Indra Pramit Das has been making a mark for many years in the SF and fantasy magazines, and the publication of The Devourers in 2015 marked his breakthrough. The novel featured a werewolf as a central character and interwove elements from the history and mythology of Bengal with werewolf lore very effectively. Sukanya Datta, a strange scientist, has kept the tradition of writing in order to kindle the sense of the wonder of science going in her many collections, often aimed at a very diverse audience. Aniket Javare in Neon Fish in Dark Water, and he's a Dalit writer, by the way. This was set in 2050, a remarkable attempt at mapping the dark side of metropolitan existence in the time of simulations and virtual reality, indicating the vulnerability of the shadow city inhabited by the dispossessed and the marginalized. In the younger generation, we see in the work of the younger generation, we see SF tropes and metaphors being constantly reinvented. S.B. Divya published an important collection of stories, contingency plans for the apocalypse and other possible situations, including Microbiota and the Masses, a love story set in Bangalore, by the way. And it's her meditation on the isolated situation of those enclosed in protective biobubbles on account of rare health conditions, due to which romance becomes a fraught option. Sami Ahmed Khan is the author of Aliens in Delhi, a novel which makes a parabolic comment on the pervasiveness of communications technology, which may even be used as the platform for an alien invasion, thus making us think afresh about alienness. He has also, of course, written extensively as a scholar of Indian essay. Memi Mondal is a Dalit writer who has made a name for herself with a critical study of Octavia Butler, and her published SF stories and fantasy stories, including The Haunting Tale, The Sea Sings at Night, have appeared in varied magazines and journals. This is a story about the blurring of boundaries between the denizens of the sea and the land. Geeti Chandra also writes both fantasy and SF, and her story, The Goddess Project, is an instance of her distinctive feminist vision as the dwellers in the interstices of the city upend established patriarchal hierarchies. M.G. Vasanji, better known perhaps for his literary depictions of life in the Indian diaspora in East Africa and later Canada, experimented with the genre in his novel Nostalgia, in which memory transference across bodies allows the seemingly indefinite perpetuation of life after death. Along the way, cases of leaked memory syndrome complicate the transition from one body to the next, as discovered by the nostalgia doctor at the center of the narrative. Philosophical reflections on memory and identity are interspersed with the fast-paced SF thriller structure in this particular narrative, which makes it a compelling read. Similarly, Prayag Akbar charted a dystopian scenario in Leela, his novel about a future society overrun by religious authoritarianism. This was, of course, made into, as everyone knows, a Netflix series by Deepa Mehta, Shankar Raman, and Pawan Kumar in 2019. Again, Bangalore-based designer Lavanya Lakshminarayan has written a set of interconnected speculative stories titled Analog Virtual and Other Simulations of Your Future, in which she projects trends in high-tech into a future world where demarcations of rank and class are crucial to access to the enclosed realm of the digitally connected and powerful apex city controlled by the Bell Corporation. Even in this simulation-infested world divided into the analogs and virtuals, resistance is possible, and the illusions generated by digital technology are eventually shattered. On the other hand, Tashan Mata's The Liar's Weave offered an intricate account of an alternate history, recuperating a history of castaways in a world in which astrology has real meaning and futures can not only be predicted but changed. This may be an instance of what one might describe as genre mixing, actually. The Parsi protagonist Zahan Merchant's lies transform reality, altering timelines and constructing a parallel version of history, which the outcasts who inhabit the Vidroha hinterland hope to tap into to usher in dramatic changes in the world. Gautam Bhatia is a Supreme Court lawyer and editor at Strange Horizons, roles he commingles in a way in his recent novel, The War. Mithila, his youthful protagonist, is a citizen of Sumer, a city bounded by a wall which constrains movement according to time-honored rules, which also define set rules for all. Bhatia brings in his legal acumen as he charts the course of a rebellion against strictures that limit freedom of various kinds in this allegory about the need to question limits and boundaries, whether physical or metaphysically ordained. Right. I had a section on some of the anthologies, which perhaps I won't get into, except just to flag that Mithila Review is an online magazine which does excellent work, and you can search for back issues online. Saliksha, founder, has just handed over the reins to another set of editors, so do have a look at that sort of online site. Mithila Review once again. And then, well, okay, just to mention the titles, Magical Women was edited by Sukanya Venkatraghavan. It sought to collate recent writing in the SFF vein by women, united by the principle of feminine magic, often deploying divinely endowed characters from mythological narratives to question patriarchal certitudes in these stories. I liked in particular stories by Shweta, Taneja, S.V. Sujata, and Tashan Mehta in particular. Then Vinayak Verma's Strange Worlds, Strange Times brings together stories for young adults. Again, I won't go into details here. You can look up the book. And I have, yes, of course, as mentioned, edited the Golang's book, which has appeared in 2019, and the second volume has already been referred to. Many of these, of course, many of the authors earlier mentioned feature in these varied anthologies. Maybe I could just refer to some of the films which have appeared in the domain of science fiction. Deham was based on Manjula Padmanabhan's play Harvest, directed by Govind Nihalani in 2001. He attempted to introduce such serious SF themes to the Indian audience. The story about organ harvesting from third world donors for first world recipients had a resonance that sadly did not translate into box office success at the time. Like many such experiments, this artistic treatment of a sensitive subject did not initiate a wave, despite the distinction of its director, and turned out to be a dead end like many such crossover initiatives. Unfortunately, in Bollywood, SF motifs are often used as a pretext for lowbrow comedy or thrills, raised to the level of satirical comedy in Rajkumar Irani's PK in 2014, a story about the bewilderment faced by an alien visitor at the ills of human society. Of course, we are all reminded at this point of the script for the Alien, written by Satyajit Ray, which never got filmed, and perhaps so as an idea stolen in Hollywood, since the script was in circulation there, and later became E.T. But yeah, back to India, the arrival of OTT platforms has opened the space for more complex narratives, and Aarti Kadav's Cargo in 2019 combined elements from mythology and SF in the science fantasy about demons processing souls after death in outer space. But much remains to be done. I would say the script writing needs strengthening for sure. So as we have seen, and here I'm just going to sum up what I've said about the Indian SF scene, the range is notable, even though the subgenre is yet to match the level of, say, Chinese for that, or for that matter, Anglo-American SF. Experimentation is more to be seen now. The best writing synthesizes the strengths of older narrative traditions, whether mythology, epic, fable, or fantasy, with elements from contemporary SF, including, of course, even cyberpunk, feminist SF, solar punk for that matter, in order to come to terms with the dilemmas of our post-colonial reality more than 70 years after partition and independence. While the influence of SF models, such as especially to be found in the Golden Age, was palpable in the earlier phase, contemporary Indian SF seems to be moving in its own direction. This is also as a result of the differential impact of changes ushered in after the greater integration of the Indian economy and the developmental state with the world system, and the advent of multiple media forms, not least the ubiquitous social media. So Indian SF narratives have addressed both the perception of consequent losses in cultural identity and the at times problematic gains in the scientific and technological realms, often through dystopian representations of the crises being faced today. Whether it is artificial intelligence or biotech, the concentration of corporate power in the digital era, or the complications ushered in by virtuality and simulations, especially in the era of social distancing, Indian SF has grappled with the issues at stake in, for the most part, original ways. In the process, we can see a redefinition of the category of realism, as this variant of new realism takes into account the imaginative ecology and economy of 21st century India, projecting contrary impulses and ambivalences in fictive form across time and space. Indeed, the at times surreal juxtapositions of ancient and modern geographies and cosmologies in this subgenre may be read, I argue, as productive heterotopias in Foucault's sense, where you have a kind of conjoining, as it were, of often widely disparate time and temporal and spatial, as it were, strands. Even as they continue to generate alternative visions for the future of the region and the world, perhaps even an alternate variant of futurism. So this is what I focused on in my article on Indian science fiction of the 21st century, which constituted the last part of my talk. But since I did, after all, in my title, say that I would speak about India and South Asia, so I'll just, in a kind of synoptic way, perhaps allude to some of the interesting new voices appearing in the sphere of South Asian science fiction outside our boundaries. So if we extend the discussion to our region as a whole, we can see a range of talent coming to the fore, especially in the 21st century. Sri Lankan science fiction has really taken vast strides, and Vajra Chandrasekhar, Yudhanjaya Vijayaratne, who of course has also written a rice punk manifesto, perhaps taking forward the idea of cyberpunk, but situating it in a more specific, culturally kind of grounded way, and also departing in some significant ways from perhaps the cyberpunk framework. This can be accessed online, by the way. Naveen Veeraratne is another major voice, as well as Mary Mohan Raj. They're all crossing new thresholds in their creation of an SF idiom, which is reminiscent of the finest in their rich cinematic tradition. Say in the work of filmmakers like Prasanna Vithanage. I'm a great admirer of his work. Often we find the stories haunted by the aftermath of course, the Civil War. But again, I would leave it to a more competent scholar of SF from Sri Lanka to say more meaningful things. In Pakistan, again, luckily Nusrat Kamal has begun to trace that history. So I needn't again repeat what she has said in several online articles. But yes, we have figures like Usman Malik, who's also known for his work in horror and whose collection Midnight Doorways is soon to appear. Bina Shah, who's written a remarkable dystopian feminist novel, and then Sana Ahmed, Haris Durrani, and Kehkeshan Khalid, all leading the way. And this is especially after the setting up of the Salam Award for Imaginative Writing, which is helping to identify and groom a new generation of writers in both literary and SFF, as it were, category. And the categories themselves are, as I think I hinted at earlier, beginning to blur in any case. We don't necessarily have to speak of the literary and genre in such a kind of distinct way, because there's a sense in which that mixing is taking place and a form of hybridization is already at work. And perhaps to conclude, I can refer to especially the work of, in Bangladesh, Saad Hussain, who has carved out a niche with his blend of Jin lore and SF tropes such as nanotech. At this point, I can't help but refer back to an article I had written some time ago. And in particular, I would like to allude to the Bangladeshi poet Kaiser Haq's poem, speculative poem, 2020, N. Before turning to the poem, I should mention that speculative poetry is as important perhaps as the fiction we've been alluding to, and perhaps again hasn't received its due in recent times. But some of the anthologies have carried speculative poetry, and more is, I hope, likely to appear, including in my own forthcoming anthology. So in this poem, which in fact it will feature there, Kaiser Haq very subtly plays on the meaning of the scientific term coronavirus, which we are all sick and tired of hearing about, but have to face nonetheless as a day-to-day existential reality. So he envisages instead the future advent of a karuna or compassion virus named 2020 Nkarvi. In this ironic reflection on our times, the poet depicts the assiduous attempts by states to quarantine this new virus. It's dangerous. You can't have too much compassion circulating in this world. So the spread amongst animal lovers and others thus must be neutralized. We find here an ethical meditation on the absence of this key civilizational value in today's world, as well as a reflection on the insidious effects of such a disaster as we're facing today on both language and expression. Perhaps it is such imaginative resistance to the advent of banal forms of authoritarianism and moral policing, often buttressed by purported science in the guise of aiding the public good, that may generate hope for the future to come in South Asia of the future. Thank you very much. I hope I've done okay with respect to time, leaving plenty of time for Q&A. Yeah, over to Chandan. Chandan, I can't hear you.
I had muted myself. Sorry,
Yes.
Tarun. Tarun, thank you very much for this wonderful canvas drawing exercise. I mean, you really gave us a glimpse of, mapping the key voices and their concerns. I have a few questions, and the audience, while we wait for them to raise questions, let me just note that Naveen Veeraratne, who you mentioned, after he heard you say that you admire his work, he says "woohoo" in the comment section. Pass it on to you. And I hadn't heard of him, so I look forward to reading him now. Tarun, I have a few questions. I mean, there's a question here that I'll put on the screen for you. Ravin, you need to put it on his screen.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Should I begin? Or
Yes.
would you like to?
No,
okay.
please.
Okay. Yes. So certainly, in fact, there's even scholarship now which focuses on SF for children and young adults. In fact, and this is a kind of question perhaps which I must address with a certain degree of dissatisfaction. Much of Indian SF writing was in effect designed only for children. Unlike in the West, where, at least to begin with, right from the outset, there was always a kind of greater, perhaps, range, with some stories, say, Flash Gordon, the comics, the kind of science fiction you would get for in the early phase of the pulps would be consumed mainly by young adults, teenagers, and children. But there would always be sort of alongside that in the same magazines, pretty serious science fiction writing. Here we've not had the same kind of magazine culture in any case. And so, in effect, much science fiction writing tended to be rather sort of designed to propagate scientific values and the scientific temper sometimes amongst children. So you would get, a story focusing on a scientific problem, and perhaps the illustration of the problem was deemed to be sufficient, and the resolution of the tangle which ensued from a kind of incorrect, unscientific approach. Now, this perhaps kind of evocation of the greatness of science, the wonder of science, something I did hint at, perhaps had its points, but it could also perhaps weaken perhaps the self-critical dimension and the storytelling dimension. But let me not say this as a judgment on the entirety of young adult or children's writing. I know, for example, that Sanam Khanna, who may be listening in, is a scholar who's working exactly on this particular question of young adult science fiction writing in India and and perhaps South Asia. But yes, in more recent times, I think it's become more complex. Even, for example, the comics written in the Indian context, we have graphic narrative by Apu Pen, the Snake and the Lotus, which I sort of recently came across, and such writing from writers in along such lines were also collated by, of course, the author I mentioned in my talk in Strange Worlds, Strange Times. So that's a collection which kind of, is aimed at a particular kind of perhaps demographic, but also transcends it because the storytelling is so good. I mean, Vanna Singh's story there could fit in any collection of the greatest SF stories. It just doesn't have to, that's Vinayak's collection. So it doesn't just have to fit in with a kind of particular categorization. So I think we need such stories. Obviously, maybe children especially tend to benefit from being introduced to science through storytelling, and science popularization is a whole scene in its own right. I mentioned Sukanya Datta's writing. She has published several collections with NBT. So NBT's whole sort of mandate is to, of course, reach out to the younger generation. But my point is that we also need a more self-critical, self-reflexive variant of science fiction, which can also account for some of the problems which have arisen as a result of this espousing of Western science or modern science in a completely kind of uncritical way, as I've said earlier. So therefore, science fiction, even I wonder if that can be done for children as well. I think so. Perhaps that's possible. I mean, why couldn't we have a story about destructive development for kids, which is simultaneously interesting and in the SF vein? It could be done. So yes, there is such a tradition, and yes, certainly plenty more to come, since the market seems to be really growing these days. Yeah. But my anthologies have been mainly focused on, say, the adult science fiction writers, though occasionally a few maybe qualify as young adult. Yeah. All right, so there's another question. Should I tackle the next question, Chandan, or would you like to come in there?
On the screen.
Okay, yeah, the kind of Indianness. Would you like to, is that your question then?
No, these are all audience questions.
Audience questions. Okay, I've got it. Yeah, right. So Indianness is a question worth addressing. I don't think so. It's too varied. The kind of questions which arise in the different narratives which I've looked at, and again, I'm not a specialist in the field. I must again always admit my limitations here. There would be perhaps different answers given by other scholars. But from what I could see, for example, it depends on the moment we're looking at. I think Indianness of a very interesting sort is manifested in Jagdish Chandra Bose's story. Now, you remember that he's a person who is as much interested in spiritualism as in science. So yes, he presents the idea of this sort of the theory of surface tension which helps the bottle, which is the basis for the bottle of hair oil to calm the cyclone in his story. But then in the second version, which was revised and presented in 1921, Runaway Cyclone is the second version's title, the bottle of hair oil comes from a very revered guru who designs the formula for the hair oil. So is that kind of recourse to indigenous wisdom? Is he seemingly suggesting that the roots of science may be more variegated than we might assume? Remember, Jagdish Chandra Bose is someone who has faced a kind of disparagement of his science by fellow scientists who assume that because he's from India, and that was in the, remember, colonial era, therefore his discoveries, his work can be dismissed as effectively not being perhaps scientifically sort of grounded enough. So in other words, there is a kind of Indianness there which has a kind of universalism which is at the heart of it. He's not combating colonialism in a crude sort of way. He's taking a position which allows for this understanding, and here I'm drawing on some of the insights of Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, who knows this history rather well, on an understanding of the perhaps multiple sources and roots of science in a kind of global context. It could be traced back to ancient civilizations in Egypt and Sumer. There's a fascinating story by Kurutule and Haider titled Roshni Ki Raftar, which takes a protagonist from India in a time machine back to ancient Egypt. So there's a dialogue of civilizations almost, which takes place again in a rather whimsical way, because it's not as if, again, she's trying to present a very serious account of time travel. It's more about this interest in the long-standing dialogues which someone like Amitav Ghosh has tackled in a more serious way in a book like An Antique Land, between civilizations. So Indianness in a kind of plural kind of register is what I'm more interested in. I don't think it would be productive for us to go looking for that kind of particular, shall we say, manifestation of Indianness as a kind of flag which writers have to necessarily wave in order to identify themselves as being different from Western writers, or for that matter from Pakistani writers or Sri Lankan writers. So it's more subtle, it's more nuanced. It comes through in the characters, in the places. It's wonderful, for example, how in so many of these stories, cities are embodied and presented in a futuristic vein, like in Lavanya's story about future Bangalore. Set of stories about future Bangalore. So there's a kind of evocation perhaps of what we have done wrong with city planning and the urbanscape, the blighted urbanscape. We also find that in the case of perhaps Western cyberpunk. But it's the particular inflection taken by SF in our context, as technology has had a different perhaps impact given our very distinct culture and our civilizational inheritance, which makes it so fascinating. So, and this is a point which I take from Francesco Verso, my sort of friend in Italy, who has reflected upon these issues in his own way, as he sort of puts together anthologies drawn from varied parts of the world, one to which I had also contributed. Yeah. Yeah. So Anglo-American SF, I think I was more intent here on obviously tracing the commonalities and ways in which perhaps there are parallels, as Bal Fonke pointed out. But I think perhaps the differences also yawn wide. The biggest difference, I think the clearest difference, if one were to put it bluntly, is to say that in the West, science fiction has become mainstream. It is both commercially successful, and it has a particular kind of, shall we say, wing, which is literary, if you like, or where you find literary authors of literary fiction venturing into this form of genre fiction. It's not always with successful results, as in the case of Ian McEwan's recent novel, Machines Like Us, where he seems to be somewhat unaware of some of the previous writing in the genre, which has already happened on the subject of, say, artificial intelligence, for example, say. But then to say that is not to make a claim for Indian science fiction as being necessarily more virtuous, because I'm sure the writers here would love to be bestsellers, would love to occupy commercial space, would love to have their works adapted for film. But it's not happened yet. I'm not sure what the reasons are. Shiv Vishwanathan speaks of the fact that there are so many mythological narratives and narratives featuring, demons and mythological beings, that perhaps as a result, and we know that mytho-fantasy is a roaring success, unlike science fiction. So perhaps that has supplanted the SF impulse in our context. But again, we shouldn't disregard the few instances which, in some cases, sought to emulate Western science fiction, but also broke away to form what I was referring to as perhaps a kind of eddy, which became a stream and eventually a river. So now we find it's really coming far much more to the fore. There are so many more talented writers one can sort of notice and give adequate credence to. Thank you. Yeah. So SF, therefore, needs to perhaps emerge from its, what I'm saying is essentially that SF in India, and for that matter in South Asia, needs to emerge from its niche. Not necessarily to become a mass market phenomenon like, say, Hollywood has made of it in the Western context, but at least to perhaps be placed in the bookshelves alongside, say, historical fiction or mytho-fantasy, and it needs to be taken more seriously by the readers. So I'll toss that back to the readers. I noticed that, for example, the Bangalore bookstore, like Blossoms, they have such a superb collection of science fiction, and not just Indian science fiction, but Western science fiction. That's good to see. That's a good sign. Yeah. Popular tropes, so popular elements, of course. Look, again, the distinction I made between the two, which follows up on the previous question, was the Western and, say, Indian science fiction, is that in the case of the Western pulp tradition, that's what was what occupied the mainstream space. So you had stories about battles in outer space, the space opera tradition of E. Doc Smith and others, right? You had monsters invading Earth. The more serious variant of that was H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which became a comment on colonialism, an allegorical reference to the colonial era. But many of those pulp models were patriarchal in bent, often rather misogynistic, and they even had an imperial dimension underpinning them, as SF scholars have shown. So that popular, quote-unquote, popular dimension is not without its problems, and I think needs to be, therefore, perhaps, again, looked at rather critically, which is what, in fact, has happened within the context of serious rethinking by feminist SF writers. Say, I mentioned Le Guin and James Tiptree Jr., but also Octavia Butler and a host of Afrofuturist writers, N.K. Jemisin being perhaps one of the most recent in the Western context. So that's something which certainly has led to an alteration of what is acceptable in the popular domain. You will not have stereotypical black characters presented, as might have been the case earlier in early works of SF in that context. In the Indian context, it's more difficult to identify, because I guess, again, would have to look at this from region to region. But in the writing I'm most familiar with, in the post-90s writing, I think, again, it's highly individualized. Each writer may be, for example, Vandana Singh's writing. I'm a great admirer of her work. So she is certainly influenced by the work of Ursula Le Guin. But in her writing, her research has taken her in an anthropological vein to research into Eskimo lore. She has written a story located in the far north of the United States, in Alaska and the Arctic region. And it's because of the kind of concerns she has with pressing issue like, say, climate change. So if by popular we are referring to tropes and metaphors, I don't think there's a kind of common underlying thread. Maybe so to some extent in terms of, say, certain mythological tropes may certainly occasionally reappear, like in the case of that collection I mentioned, Magical Women, where you find the reconfiguring of figures from mythology as strong women. But it's being appropriated. The popular or ancient, perhaps, idiom is being reappropriated to present it in a new light. What's more exciting, perhaps, is the way in which, in some of these writings, issues allow for a kind of new lens to appear, which crystallizes thought about the future to come, especially with respect to pressing issues like climate change. And there I'm thinking especially of Anna Singh's work, or for that matter, issues like surveillance in our society, as in the case of some of the work of Shovan Chaudhary, and for that matter, Anil Menon. Thank you. No, I think I addressed this issue right now. I can't explain why it's not popular. I gave you one theory as regards that. That's Shiv Vishwanathan's idea that mythology is so predominant that perhaps, therefore, it supersedes innovation, perhaps, along such line. But look, it's surprising because, after all, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were popular and translated into the Indian languages. So why is it that, say, unlike, say, mystery fiction, detective fiction, which evolved into really strong genres, say, in Hindi and Urdu, that didn't happen? It's a bit surprising. It's not an issue of these writers not addressing social issues, because I think I've demonstrated adequately, especially in recent times, the social is being addressed, but in a complex way. I'm reminded here of Ray Bradbury's wonderful definition or account of SF as being in some ways analogous to the shield carried by Perseus. So as you remember in that story, there was a situation where Perseus had to confront the Medusa, and her eyes would turn anyone who looked at her into stone. So he borrowed Athena gave him her shield, and he used that as a mirror in which to sight Medusa. So in Ray Bradbury's account, what we find here is that Medusa is the present. It's sometimes just too horrific to look at. We get despondent, our creative impulse would be dulled. To be able to look at it, it's perhaps beyond our care. But instead, we take the ricochet vision allowed by SF, and SF is the shield, in which we see the reflection. It's a mirror image of the present, but located in a future context, as I described in some of the narratives which I summarized in my talk. So therefore, I don't think we can expect SF to necessarily always be socially conscious in a progressivist way. It's rather this kind of ability to absorb the zeitgeist and generate a kind of critical vantage point through, often enough, what also in another context Darko Suvin calls the estrangement effect, where the real is displaced again into a kind of alternate either temporal zone or alternate spatial zone, and we can return to the present via that detour, as it were. So, and that's happening. It's happening in the best of the writing at present. Will there be a tipping point and SF become really successful and popular? Only time will tell. But as I said, for me, Bangalore is my sort of, it's the example of the way in which actually an SF culture may actually thrive, fostered by, figures like Gautam Shenoy, who I hope is tuned in, who's running a quiz on SF every week, which people could locate, who runs popular discussions on SF every month, and who writes columns where he analyzes and discusses not just Indian SF, but Western SF as well. So that's really what we need, more popularization along the right lines, not just for the sake of making more, selling more copies of books. Yeah. Thank you. Science fiction cinema here, that's slightly sensitive subject. Yeah, not great, I must admit. Yeah, I like the references. Kubrick 2000, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Compelling both from hard SF angle. There's a lot of research which went into that. After all, we saw perhaps the first iPads there, the long-range communication devices where people could be seen on the screen as I am being seen by so many people, including people in Bangalore. So yeah, and of course, Tarkovsky's adaptations of the great work of the brothers Strugatsky in the case of course, his work, Roadside Picnic, and then of course Stanislaw Lem's work, Solaris. So metaphysical, but philosophical. Obviously, also there's a kind of dimension of serious science underpinning it, because he's also looking at psychological questions, and it's more about inner space in the sense that I refer to. It's in that sense a good example of soft SF. Perhaps also leaning at times towards hard SF with the kind of speculations about metamorphs in the case of Solaris on a planet which is yet to be discovered. We could talk about Western SF films for a long time if we had more time. And but coming back to the Indian scene, again, uninspiring, as I alluded to at the end of my talk in a kind of synoptic way. I was unhappy that Deham, though again a brave attempt, a courageous attempt by Govind Nihalani, did not initiate a series of such experiments by prominent filmmakers. You can access Deham on YouTube and decide whether you like it. But prior to that, probably someone like Sami Ahmed Khan would have a more detailed understanding of the very early attempts. But they're more just in terms of SF as a pretext for laughs and humor. Really, aliens don't sort of prompt serious metaphysical questioning. But in Bollywood, there are a few instances of that, at least these days. Anyway. Maybe the OTT platforms, we need more enlightened experiments given the opportunities afforded by OTT platforms, which need not always necessarily go the way of metaphysical narratives embedded in our cultural tradition, that is a retelling of mythological stories. Why don't they actually sort of conjoin metaphysics and serious science fictional concerns and tropes? About this whole question of what artificial intelligence is doing to us in our day-to-day existence, for example, with the ubiquity of social media and so forth. But apart from a few scant references in films like Cargo, you're not really getting that. Even Cargo left me, vaguely dissatisfied. Yeah. So it's an interesting, experiment, but not yet quite there. We need more courageous experimentation, just like in the field of SF publishing. We need more publishers willing to try their hand, support good SF writing, and similarly, quality films, of course, need to be made and supported by, of course, producers of SF films. Yeah, thank you. Long epic SF, I suppose you mean fantasy and SF, right? Series, right? Yeah. Well, again, I would have to concede that I am not really an expert on fantasy, since I've chosen to kind of delimit my field of inquiry, as any scholar must. There is a demand for it. I would say, especially the retold mythological narratives have spurred the sales in that particular domain. And certainly some writers of literary fiction have also delved into this arena and retold some of the stories, sometimes with a particular political bent. So you could have a feminist retelling of a particular story. But I think long epic narratives with a kind of, with the grandeur of, say, an Ursula Le Guin's kind of vision, are beginning to appear. I'm getting a sense of that after reading, for example, Gautam Bhatia's The Wall, which has been much appreciated and is the first novel, after all, in his Sumer trilogy. So maybe, yes, it's the time has come for such narratives to appear, and the sky's the limit, really. But again, I would have to say that there's a difference there's a slight difference, I would say, between SF epics and space operas and the kind of writing that I'm more that I have been noticing in the Indian context. It's the short stories which I have focused on. There have been some longish novels, but perhaps that too is a lacune yet to be remedied. We need more long SF, perhaps novels and even series, which actually push the frontiers of the genre even further. Thank you. Okay, mythology. All right. So it's very problematic. Mythology has been used, yes, as I have already said, as a kind of template. In the right hands, it can be very productive. I'll give the example of Indra Pramit Das's Shirley Jackson Prize-winning story, Kali Na, which is a kind of cyberpunk story, which I had the good fortune of reading because we're including it in the next future fiction volume, which I'm co-editing with Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay and Francesco Verso, with, of course, Indra Pramit's permission. So in that story, the Kali myth is sort of reinvented in the light of what's transpiring in the domain, again, of the social media influencers, these cyber wars, the realm of Twitter. Here, we're sort of at such a moment where there seems to be a saturation of the senses. It's like a kind of constantly evolving beast, which constantly mutates its form. And this invocation of Kali in a kind of very interesting, almost feminist light. Now that's very exciting. He, I think, there follows up on a very important collection, which was edited by Anil Menon and Vandana Singh. Fortunately, I have it with me, so I can put this on the screen. You can see the title, Breaking the Bow, speculative fiction inspired by the Ramayana. So the term speculative fiction is a more all-encompassing term. This alludes to writing in the horror vein, in fantasy, as well as in SF. The term is espoused by, say, for example, a writer like Margaret Atwood to distinguish her style of writing, more concerned with, say, crucial issues like climate change in the Mad Adams series, which she wrote, from, say, the works of the early pulp writers, which were more about, say, sort of these monsters and exotic sort of damsels and spaceships. So speculative fiction can and has, and especially as in the case of this volume, which is a commissioned volume, dealt with the epics in a very interesting way. Here they invited people to write stories inspired, speculative fictions inspired by the great epic, the Ramayana, long before perhaps the current dispensation came into power. There was a questioning of some of the tenets and the assumptions in that great foundational text of ours. So I think that ironic view which we see there, and we find not just Indian writers, but even Western writers like Levi Tidar contributing to that collection. Ian MacDonald has contributed to that collection. So I think there was a kind of openness of the vision in that volume's case. But that's not always the case. As I mentioned earlier, mythology often is used reductively. It oversimplifies by simply becoming a vehicle for pandering to our desire to be retold, a story which we are all too familiar with. To that extent, it's almost a bit like Stanislaw Lem's critique of much of American commercial SF as being kitschy. What is kitsch? It's a kind of rebooting of the same, an iteration without any innovation. So that effectively, it stalls creativity. It proves to be a barrier to further thought about mythological questions and issues. So mythology, therefore, has been a bit of a double-edged sword, but I urge you to look up some of the articles of Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, who's sort of reflected in very interesting ways upon this question of the ubiquity of mythology in many popular genres, not just SF. In fact, he coined a term, the mythologerm, to refer to this sort of propensity to have a kind of kernel of myth at the heart of a narrative, which then forms the basis for the unfolding of the story. But I think it should be done interestingly, like in Ray Bradbury's, recasting, say, of the Perseus, say, myth. It should be done interestingly and perhaps, with a kind of contemporary flavor. Thank you. Back to the pedagogic imperative, as it were, the teaching of language and literature. Why not? You certainly could. I don't think it has been much used, barring perhaps those NBT volumes. It Happened Tomorrow was published by National Book Trust, and perhaps has formed an asset, has been an asset to several teachers of science along the way. But it was one volume, 93. I don't think this volume had, sort of any follow-up which I can sort of think of. And so, again, I'm not an expert in educational matters. I've taught English literature at a college for many years, and we had a component of science fiction, which unfortunately again was Western science fiction. I taught Asimov there, but it was my sense of impatience with that. The canonical science fiction didn't seem to really meet the need of the hour. And given that there was this rich tradition evolving here, I remember hearing Jayant Narlikar speak at the Sahitya Academy, and he was an inspiring presence. I mean, someone who studied under the astrophysicist and science fiction writer Fred Hoyle at MIT, and came to write his own sort of fascinating stories, about questions which he addressed and projected into the future, including the possibility of an asteroid hit on the Earth long before the film Deep Impact. So it was great to hear that, and that's what led me to my own journey. I'm sure every teacher could find in the varied now publications that are becoming available ways of incorporating the best of the writing in their coursework, and perhaps then it becomes sort of a way of getting students excited, not just about language, not just about literature, but about the future to come. Here, I'm thinking of Manjula Padmanabhan's point, and I'm sort of a good friend of Manjula, so I can steal her idea without qualms. She says, if we don't imagine our future collectively, it will be imagined for us. So in effect, that's what good science fiction should be able to do. It should enable us to choose our own direction, to make the appropriate choices, not just uncritically imbibe the latest, say, in tech from Google or Facebook. Let me not sort of devalue these for us, since after all, we're on YouTube here. But the point I'm making is that let us absorb all that's coming our way in a critical light and understand the impact technology is having in our lives, and the dangers and also the risks involved. And perhaps that will lead to not just effective education of children, but a liberating of the child's imagination, so that they too can become good writers in their own right, whether of SF or in any other vein. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. Really interesting one. As a form of resistance. So basically, if I were to compress my answer into one line, I would say, please read the first Gollancz volume, because in effect, that's what we were attempting to do. In the light of all that's been happening in the last few years, we sent out an invitation to writers saying we would like them to reflect on what India and the subcontinent as a whole might look like 70 years from now, in say 2087. So not all the writers who contributed to the last volume did respond to that specific question, and as later one realized, perhaps that was a constraint on the imagination of the writers to a certain extent. But hey, sometimes constraints can impel us to qualitatively better resistance. And that's the irony of the situation. So I got a sense that that was indeed the case. I mean, if you look through some of the stories, K.K. Daruwala's wonderful story Set on the Moon, he absolutely pulls no punches. So yes, it's an embodiment of resistance, the volume as a whole, and perhaps, of course, there are, I shouldn't claim all the credit here. It's there was a lot of teamwork involved in that volume, and alongside what we achieved, so much else is happening along the way. I spoke of Lavanya's book. I spoke of course, Gautam Bhatia's book. So there are several interesting, Indra Pramit Das's book, and several interesting contemporary voices who do come to terms with power structures of today, with the burning questions of our time. And they're writing what we could describe as perhaps as cautionary tales. That's what perhaps SF writing can do. The idea is not to paralyze us by writing extremely bleak stories which make us so depressed that there's no capacity left for agency. On the contrary, I think there's an inference which can be drawn from sometimes even the darkest of narrative, which actually allows for that impulse to resistance to be perhaps furthered and to become the sort of basis for maybe even, who knows, new movement. In this context, the most direct perhaps example of resistance, of a resistance narrative, is the story co-authored by Ashish Kothari and KJ Joy in their collection of essays mainly titled Alternative Futures, where he imagines a meeting, a Mahasangam of activists at the end of this century. And he wonders what the country would look like then. And there's a kind of assessment taken by the activists about sort of both failures and accomplishments. So there was a moment of terrible crisis, perhaps, and he sets that moment actually, ironically enough, in the time we are living in, the 20s and 30s. After which, perhaps, there's the possibility of overcoming some of those really sort of difficult moments, and the possibility of a new future arise. So I would urge everyone to definitely look at Ashish Kothari's work, and especially his idea of an eco-Swaraj, which eventually perhaps we can all ultimately sort of ultimately move towards. Yeah. That's his conception, which here I'm acknowledging as a major inspiration for me as well. Thank you.
Tarun, I have a few questions for you. We have a little less than 15 minutes left before the session closes. And while the audience, might need time to raise its own questions too. Tarun, if you can comment on the formal properties of Indian science fiction writing. I mean, are there, what sorts of innovations do you notice in trying to, reorient us towards reality in a certain fashion?
Okay, formal. Yeah, it's a good point you raise. It's not as if there is, I think, a kind of unique formal experiment at work. Again, it depends from author to author. The most interesting, perhaps, formal experiment I can immediately recall is Anil Menon's Half of What I Say, where he pushes the limits of novel writing in a very interesting way through experimenting with narrative structure, through his technique of side shadowing, where there's a kind of anticipation or implicit telling of a story through indirection once again. So he's writers I can immediately think of where there's a kind of that element of formal experimentation. Of course, many of the writers, especially the early ones, they were pretty much using a template, a model, which they took over from Western writers and adapted in interesting ways to their own kind of needs. Maybe that's still happening. For example, I'm thinking of Tashan Mehta's The Liar's Weave, whether Ursula Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven could be thought of as an influence there, a story about someone whose dreams begin to reshape reality. He goes to sleep and he wakes up and he finds his dreams have reshaped the world, as we know. In her book, it's lies told by a young boy, a young Parsi boy who's the protagonist, which have the potential of shaping lives. But there's more of a sense of agency there. So what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that she's borrowed that model or trope directly from Le Guin, but there is a way in which perhaps there's a sort of braiding together of ideas. Astrology comes in, which has a distinctively Indian flavor. Dimension of Indian nationalist history comes in, but since it's an alternate history, it's a kind of different, shall we say, loop which she is exploring of history, a different, altogether different timeline, which isn't quite the same as the one we inhabit. So, in effect, there is a way in which there's this, once again, genre mixing taking place, raising of the level of the bar, as it were. Maybe what's most exciting about Indian science fiction, right from the time of Amitav Ghosh's The Calcutta Chromosome, is that it has redefined the genre by bringing in the strongly cultural elements which are to be seen. So in the case of The Calcutta Chromosome, while he's retelling the story of the malaria parasite, the discovery by Ronald Ross, he's also telling the story of a subaltern story, if you like, of a kind of parallel trajectory of research being undertaken here. So once again, this idea of indigenous forms of knowledge, of knowing, epistemologies, right, which have been neglected and which perhaps can be inserted into our contemporary knowledge system. Even forms of ontology, knowing who we are, perhaps that's become a bit frayed as we seek to become what Naipaul called the mimic men, the brown sives. So that idea of an ontological resituating of self through, sometimes ironically enough, a projection into a kind of futuristic scenario where the self is recognizable in a kind of South Asian or Indian locale, but it's not recognizable as just a kind of a formula or cliche or stereotype.
No, thank you, Tarun. The mimic man, the phrase. I mean, I think one of the things that's behind some of the questions raised already is this thing about how original is Indian science fiction. Right? I mean, you have a body of science fiction writing that's evolved from somewhere, and others are trying to situate themselves in that genre, consciously or not consciously, I don't know. And that places enormous constraints on the imagination, right? In terms of what you have to do to be a science fiction writer and the things you don't do if you want to be that, etc.
Sure.
So in this thing, I wonder where where the political imagination would matter. In the sense, when you talked about how you find responses to the contemporary political predicament, through this thing. So that could take the simple, the definition of politics is not pre-given. I mean, it's arrived at and it's consolidated itself. And so so refuting it or seeking alternate is one way of proceeding. But the other thing is to then have another perspective altogether that doesn't engage in naysaying or trying to sort of offer subversions, the familiar technique, right, of trying to respond. So with that respect, do you find attempts in the new sci-fi literature trying to who are working with I don't know whether it be the epistemological material that Ghosh points to or something else, which are all from worlds, which are not working with democracy as a default imagination and something else there.
Interesting ideas. Yeah, I mean, these are questions which require a lot more thought. But off the top of my head, I would immediately sort of begin by sort of thinking back to that moment which I highlighted at the outset of Kailash Chandra Dutt, the naive student at Presidency College.
Yes.
Under a regime of, the British in every sense possible, both at the level of curricula, at the level of politics. But he's able to, perhaps given the pre-mutiny kind of relatively liberal norms of the time, come up with this tale, which is published, after all, in a college gazette about a rebellion which fails. So the rebellion is not it's presented in a somewhat romanticized light. There's this prince who rebels, but he sees all of his dreams being destroyed as the ruthless sort of opposition to the sort of desire for freedom overrides his ambitions. And he locates this in 1945. Similarly, his cousin Shoshi Chandra Dutt comes up with a story, The Republic of Orissa, which perhaps is even more nuanced because it depicts a successful rebellion, which, however, is not the end of the story, because the tribal populations will remain dissatisfied. And perhaps he does sort of create certain kinds of obvious binaries, but the new elites are perhaps not necessarily the enlightened rulers that one might have expected in the light of a, say, successful anti-colonial resistance movement. So the problems, therefore, continue afterwards. So to envisage that as students in the 1830s with no long tradition, again, no reflection on politics, perhaps to draw upon, except perhaps the kind of climate of the times in which, sort of perhaps, which includes, the Enlightenment thinkers, perhaps whom they had been exposed to in college as well. But this is before the French, after 1789, but yeah, perhaps before some of the sort of crucial moments in our sort of anti-colonial resistance, like the uprising of 1857 and all the rest of that. So quite remarkable. So what I'm trying to suggest is, through these instances and illustration, Begum Ruqayya Hussein's story about a feminist utopia, where it's not just inversion, but the women taking responsibility for every aspect of governance. So the question in my mind is, why didn't these little fables of resistance, of dissent, become traditions in their own right and lead to a kind of evolving discourse, if you like, even in their respective terrain and languages, say Bengali, in this instance. But the Bengali scholars, at least I've been in touch with, tell me that there was no utopian tradition of writing. Instead, it turns more and more dystopian, in fact, as years go by. So dystopian writing has its place. There, it's more a question, again, of inferences, the negative critique of negative values. So again, that has its place. You see the darkness, and perhaps then you make inferences about what the light might look like. The derivativeness of the discourse, relevant to the extent that, yes, if it were just plain copy pasting, then I think we have a problem. But I think all writers, they internalize influence and they process that in their own distinctive ways, and then they come up perhaps with their own individual sort of variants and solutions, their own adaptation. We've seen that in the case of theater. We've seen that case in the case of the novel form. Perhaps you know best with respect to the work of someone like Ananthamurthy. So he's gleaning from all sorts of sources, and then devising his own unique solutions in the case of, say, a great novel like Samskar, or for that matter, the novel you translated, Bharat. So it's a kind of situation of being caught in a cleft stick, almost a kind of double bind, especially during the colonial moment. And since then, perhaps with plurality of options opening up, sometimes it seems as if excess might prove to be a question of might lead to a situation of surfeit of options, and trying to include too much. I noticed this in some of the new writing, that perhaps there is this attempt to encompass it all, and you want to bring in all the contemporary problems faced by us today, whether it's the social media or whether it's the political discourse in its most obvious sort of retrograde manifestation. And that leads to a kind of sense of fatigue for the reader too, because you're not able to process the element. A bit like, sitting too long in sort of chat room on cyberspace. So I think there are both pros and cons with the kind of, say, attempts to negotiate the realm of the political. It's not necessarily per se a political genre, but it has been taken in that direction by writers like Orwell, by Aldous Huxley, and that has provided a template for writers to especially engage with this moment of hyper-surveillance, hyper-reality in new and nuanced ways, which I see especially in some of the most interesting instances of the genre.
Tarun, a few questions, but we can go a little beyond 5 if it's necessary.
Sure.
I just thought I'd put them on the table. please see how you want to take them on. One is, the fact that we don't have an evolved, the history of Indian science is not part of, our historical imagination, either of the university kind or of the popular kind. So I wonder what that has meant, that gap, for people who want to write, science fiction. I mean, in terms of, you go to mythology straight away if you don't want to look at past material, but then there is this material of, quote unquote scientific activity, which we know happened, and there is documentation of a kind, but it's still not really all that familiar. So the history of science not being available, and what its implications might have been on how SF writing is evolving in India, if you just plot speculative answers.
Yeah.
And the other question I had, Tarun, is the Casey Dutt, the person you just mentioned, and his relative. They're having you made a distinct. You said it's a futuristic story.
Yeah.
And all futuristic stories need not be science fiction exercises. So I was just wondering if the futuristic writing might enjoy more freedom than those that try to be sci-fi writing, because you don't have to then somehow make science matter in some way. I mean, however construed. I was just wondering if comment on this. More sociological question of a modest kind. All these writers are urban and middle class, perhaps, and English educated. Do you have some sense for what that has meant for the kind of sci-fi imagination that we are, that we have had to, see?
Okay, right. Okay, so you can remind me if I forget the first question first. But I'd like to first take up the second question, or okay, why not take them in reverse order? So yeah, middle class writers and writers often with a diasporic location. But amongst whom you find there are some, as I've mentioned earlier, the Dalit writers or writers with Dalit background at least. And their vision perhaps is a little different and more a different angle we can see. Perhaps the question of power becomes more kind of central to their sort of writing. But again, it's perhaps yet to be mapped effectively, the sociological dimension and the sort of cultural politics which perhaps underlie this. There are some attempts to trace this history, like Suparno's history, but perhaps those tend to sometimes, not necessarily Suparno alone, but in some of these accounts, perhaps juxtapose these writers in ways which don't pay sufficient attention to their social locations. And sometimes that is a crucial aspect, as you rightly point out. The question of access to certain kinds of circuits of travel, the globalized world in which we live in, to what extent have these writers actually been able to physically navigate across the spaces which have sort of come into existence. So it's an interesting problem. Just remind me of the second question again, and then I'll take the third. I perhaps
the question about the history of science, the history of Indian science.
History of Indian science. So yeah, I did mention Jagdish Chandra Bose as a practicing scientist who actually suffered from prejudice, colonial prejudice, racist prejudice. And there's been an interesting look at his work in that light, which seeks to look at his writing, even that one story, and some of his speeches as forms of kind of anti-colonial politics. But what sort of politics? Once again, not obviously or sort of very explicitly anti-colonial politics, not nationalist in a kind of, again, self-evident way. There is a kind of subdued or muted nationalism, a form of thinking about perhaps science and knowledge systems, and for that matter, creativity, with a kind of universal vision underpinning it. As again, I'm here drawing on Bodhisattva's insight. So this kind of particular kind of story again could have formed the basis for perhaps a whole multitude of stories written by practicing scientists. I mean, one wonders what would Meghnad Shah have written if he had set out to write a science fiction story. But no, he was a futurist of a different ilk, perhaps, more interested in the practical world, in applied science, if you will, right? What if more scientists like Narlikar had the chance to, sort of try their hand at this genre? What would have transpired? Vanna Singh writes as a scientist who's proficient in storytelling. She combines the best of both worlds, I think, and is knowledgeable about the history of science and, for that matter, the philosophy of science. I think her understanding of climate change comes from this one very sort of close sort of look which has been taken by her at the debates on climate change and the transformations taking place in our contemporary sort of world in terms of hard data and scientific analysis. She has traveled to far-flung places to look at the actual impact of climate change on marginalized communities. She has written about the impact on communities like that, like those sort of likely to be worst affected in coastal regions of Bangladesh in some of her science fiction. So I think Vanna Singh is an excellent example of the best kind of sort of use of, if you like, a kind of meta, shall we say, awareness of science. But much more perhaps needed to have been done perhaps by some of the science fiction writers themselves. As I pointed out earlier, those who thought of science in a merely didactic light was simply relaying scientific ideas. In Balfonte's collection, there are several of the very trite stories which are meant to be educational in a kind of obvious way, and those don't really make us think about the historical dimensions to science and its sort of the fact that it was brought in at a particular historical moment and took on a different inflection perhaps after being introduced here, or for that matter even technology. And this is surprising enough, despite the advent of series like Black Mirror, which is constantly bombarding us with these dark messages about the imminent implosion of our world as a result of the introduction of high tech. So why aren't more scientists writing this? Why aren't symposiums being held at IIT? There have been a few attended by, amongst others, like people like Anil Menon and Jay Narlikar. We held one of the launches of our book at IIT Delhi, but I must confess that I was pretty disappointed by the students' response, who again wanted to just hark back to the glories of ancient science. So they have this very romanticized view, which we all know where it's coming from, of the greatness of the Indian past and the sort of flying chariots being based on real science and all the rest of that sort of very idyllic view of the past. So it's maybe too many scientists have invested in the wrong form of nationalism. I mean, that would be one answer perhaps to your question. And they're not self-critical enough. They haven't read enough science fiction would have alerted them to the pitfalls perhaps of such a kind of sort of embracing of a mythologized view of science.
Tarun, I had another question about futuristic writing as being a little more, freer than science fiction. That seems to have colonized that space completely. It seems like.
Yeah, that's
because the two examples from Bengal you gave me, you said were examples of futuristic writing, and they're not trying to be.
No, absolutely. I see what you mean. No, look, there is a branch of knowledge, futurology.
Yes.
Ashish Shakti is
yes.
one of the best-known exemplars or practitioners of futurology. And he has a wonderful essay, by the way, on Satyajit Ray's science fiction, which is in The Savage Poet. And he gave a lecture last year on what India would look like, his vision of India in 2047. So yeah, futurology. Yuval Noah Harari is one of the best known, again, historians who are practicing futurology and anticipating what are the trends to come. And the technique most of these guys use is extrapolation. Extrapolation is exactly the central technique of science fiction. I'm not saying they have learned it from, maybe it's a kind of two-way, let's say, learning curve that the science fiction writers have learned from the futurologists, and the futurologists have also been reading their science fiction and sort of absorbing the lessons from the best of the writers to that effect. So what kind of extrapolation? You examine carefully some of the elements of the particular mix you are living in at the given moment, and then you extend it logically. It could be a near future account, or it could be a far future account. In the far future account, well, predictions essentially go haywire. And by the way, some people have argued that, well, science fiction is much better at prevention than prediction.
Mhm.
That's to say, many of the predictions of science fiction tend to be wildly wrong. To give you an example, William Gibson is a famous writer of cyberpunk fiction, and he wrote a novel titled Neuromancer, which everyone knows, I'm sure, who are fond of the genre, and it in which the term cyberspace appeared for the first time. But this was before the invention of the net as we know it. So in his version, people jacked into the internet through electrodes put into their skulls. And at one point, and this is, I'm taking this from an interview he gave, one of the characters, where he admits to his own folly, as it were, one of the characters says to another, hey, give me a modem. So at that point, William Gibson did not know the tech enough to be able to get it accurate. So prediction, well, science fiction has never been good at that. But yes, extrapolation, in order to sort of garner a certain understanding of the present in this refracted way, through this prism, once again, or lens, which allows us to come back to the future. Now, whether then this is science fictional or futuristic is a good question in its own right. There's another term we could bring into the mix, utopian writing. So utopian writing begins with, of course, Thomas More's Utopia. Perhaps we could trace it as far back as that. A model of a kind of society based on a given society, English society of Thomas More's era. But the model allows for a certain critique, again, of the present through the kind of look it takes at the way in which a society perhaps was shaped in his fictional rendition. Similarly, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards fancies man being transported to the 21st century, and he looks back from that position where most of the issues of the 19th century have been resolved, and it was written in the late 19th century, and he looks back at the 19th century from that vantage point and sees how many things which were absolutely wrong with the industrial age which he lived in. In our own context, Rahul Sankratyayan wrote Baisvi Sadi, where man wakes up in the 22nd century and he discovers that most of the problems of world governance have been solved. There's a kind of universal government. It's another matter that I think everybody in his work speaks Hindi, which we may not agree with, but okay, most issues relating to exploitation and dominance, colonialism is certainly dispensed with. So, and he wrote this way back, in the sort of mid 20th century. So these are expressions of utopian, perhaps aspirations and fiction, futuristic, but in a utopian way rather than a dystopian way. So I think these three terms could be put into fruitful dialogue with one another: SF, futurism, and ultimately this idea of utopian sort of expression. And ultimately, perhaps we're looking, like the Afrofuturists do, for alternative futures. That's the common, perhaps, longing, which is like the desire called utopia, which Frederick Jameson spoke of in his book, Archaeologies of the Future.
Tarun, thank you very much. Before we close, Ravi Menezes of Gube's Republic was watching this exchange. I'm not sure if you know him. It's a bookstore on Church Street. So he said, I'll just read out his comment, but there's no time for picking it up. Is there any room for amateur sci-fi comics to hit mainstream? So that's the question. And then he says this, detail, which is useful for our audience. I do an irregular science plus science fiction comic goo mix, which has a vision of a more sustainable future. Do check it out and subscribe. It's free, he says. So So thanks, Ravi. I wasn't aware of that show that you hosted. There's another question by my colleague Giri. Are there some recent SF translations in English from Indian languages that you recommend? But I'll put you in touch over email. There's no time. There's really no time. We have not extended the session this much at any before. So we should really have to 1:45, 15 now. But Tarun, thank you very much for the talk and for the engaged responses. Look forward to the second volume that you said will be out this year.
Yeah, sure. You're on July, likely. Yeah. Thank you so much. Entirely my pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Tarun, and thank you, audience, for being with us this whole time.
Yeah. Bye then. Take care.
Bye, Tarun. Yeah.